Chapter 8. Dry Grasses. "So," said Kermorven stiffly, as if surprised to find he could speak. He smiled thinly. "I am glad I never doubted your earlier experience, Elof. Here we are, still together, and it seems none the worse for whatever has become of us." "So indeed," said Ilse sharply, fixing Elof and the barren lands beyond in a single, impartial glare. "Here we are, and where's here? It still looks like part of Taunla to me, and no better than the one we left, with the night drawing in. What have we gained?" "Wherever we are," said Elof absently, gazing around him, "I am sure there is some purpose in it, though we may have to search for it. Perhaps the rocks would offer us some refuge." "A perilous one," snorted Ilse. "This whole hill is some huge ancient fall of scree and boulders, with barely enough earth about it to hold stable. It must have hit something, some standing rock or outcrop maybe, to fan out into this little notch." Elof shook his head. No outcrop. He tapped the stone he had touched in the darkness, and others strewn about. This one, that, those over there. Weathered, but the shapes are still visible. Something of dressed stone. Something man-made, or made anyhow. Ilse shook her head incredulously. "Strong enough to break that fall?" "So it would seem," said Kermorven quietly. "Some of the boulders were shaped also." Once he had pointed it out, the fact was inescapable. Many of those immense bulks looming against the cloud roof had once been subdued to a shaping hand, and this evidence of its strength held them in awe a moment. Then the rough excitement in Rock's voice broke the spell. "To hell with those pebbles! Come see what I've found." They saw him still standing in the gap between two tall stones, staring down as if at something on the ground and beckoning them urgently. He climbed up a little to squeeze his rounded frame further in. Then, with a sudden outraged howl and a deep, bouncing, echoing rumble, he vanished. Elof and the others ran to his aid, Ilse for once in the lead despite her shorter legs, bounding over the loose rock with sure-footed ease. "Hold on!" she shouted, and flung herself down on the edge of a protruding stone. "See? There's loose rubble everywhere!" But even as she spoke, the edge where she knelt collapsed. The stone pulled free and tipped her down into the darkness in a flurry of rock and dust. Kermorven, leaping up, made a futile grab at her disappearing ankles. A rumble and rattle echoed out of the dark, and a jolting shriek. "There's rubble indeed," Rock's sardonic tones echoed eerily out of the dark, and the sound of Ilse's coughing and swearing, sounding more angry than hurt. "A whole loose slide of it." "Are you all right?" "Aye, considering." "Don't move. We'll pull you up." A ghoulish chuckle floated up to them. Ilse was evidently undaunted by her fall. "No! Do you come down. There's something you should see. But your eyes need some light, and mind your head, long man." "Come down?" demanded Kermorven. "To what purpose?" Elof tapped him on the shoulder and indicated the stones flanking the gap, that had kept it from collapsing or being blocked with debris. Very worn and weather-scoured they were, those massive tilted slabs, but upon their inner surfaces the remains of neat edging and beveling still showed clear. Kermorven raised his eyes and nodded. "Very well, but what can we use for light? We have only our tinder boxes, and what little oil and kindling is in them." Elof smiled. I may be able to do something about that. Wait now. From within his tunic he pulled his gauntlet of mail and drew it on in one smooth movement. One could wish for more sun or brighter, but still. Now where is the west? Kermorven pointed, and Elof swung round and extended his hand, as if he would capture in the gem at the center of the gauntlet's palm all the pearled radiance of the westward sky. There indeed the sun sinks, said Kermorven grimly, as he stood waiting, wrapping his cloak round him against the intense cold. Over Brian, over Norderney, over all that we have left, all that now depends on us, little though it knows it, upon our quest, and there remains only 4 of us to fulfill it. The 4 who threw down the master-smith, said Elof quietly, not looking at the tall man. I know, Kermorven answered, and I think it no accident. Perhaps we were simply the hardiest, the most alert, most accustomed to long and perilous wanderings, most inured to frightening encounters. Perhaps there was something more. Who am I to say? But sorely though I regret the others, I could ill have spared any of you. So since we have come this far together, let us not be parted ere the end. He stood straighter then, and his gray eyes shone, bleak and grim as the skies, yet as lasting, as untouchable. It was Kermorven as he had been, and yet not so. It was as if his determination had indeed lost some of its fire, but became thereby all the harder. He had not lost his doubts, but in that awful moment by the fire he had confronted them, defeated them, made good use of them to grow stronger. It was a path Elof knew only too well, a journey he himself had made. At last, at the end of a long, cold half-hour, he clamped his fingers tight across the jewel. Will that suffice? Kermorven asked, as he turned to climb back to the gap. Even this week's sunlight is far stronger than torch or candle. If I let it out little by little, it will last us many hours. As long as you can maintain your grip, said Kermorven, peering doubtfully down into the darkness, and swinging himself into the gap. I go first, to be sure you do not slip. Very well, but first, let us light our way. He stepped up and checked as he felt his feet slide out from under him. But in that same instant, Kermorven's steely grip closed on his arm, and he was able to lean forward into the darkness and stretch out his fist. Slowly, carefully, he relaxed one finger a fraction. Light pooled in his palm, glinting on the metal of the gauntlet, so that it seemed to float disembodied in the blackness. Then the glow began to spread slowly, spilling down the slope of loose rubble to where Rock and Ills, scratched and disheveled, were awaiting them. Kermorven swung himself nimbly onto the treacherous slope and moved down it with ease. Elof, scuffling one-handed after him and trying not to dislodge too many stones. The air underground seemed fresh and cold as outside, but none of the odors of damp and niter he would have expected. Perhaps it was too cold for that. Now, Ills, called the warrior, as the last of the slope crunched under his boots. What is in this darksome cavern that you were so eager to show us? For one, what you're standing on, she said. Look well. Kermorven scraped idly at the layers of dust and dirt with his boot, and then dropped suddenly to one knee. A plain pattern of concentric circles had appeared, in shades of red that shone startlingly rich against the dim dust. A mosaic floor, he exclaimed. And as fine as any you've trodden, I'll warrant, said Ills, save perhaps among my folk. But this is no work of ours I recognize. Kermorven rose suddenly and seized Elof by the arm, lifting it high. And this is no cavern indeed. A wave of pale light flooded across high, smooth walls, glanced upon the angles of vaulting in the roof high overhead. Elof gazed around in astonishment. This was an intact chamber in a building, and of no mean size, at least 20 paces square. And it stood still, under the immense weight of the rockfall that had shattered its upper levels. For how long had it endured thus? 100 years? 1,000? Kermorven nodded. A strong building, Elof, as you said. But whose, I wonder, was the strength? Elof looked around in astonishment. I cannot say, but at least it offers some shelter for the night, this place. A damned chilly one, Rock grunted. At least there's no damp, though, and no nasty things crawling about. Nothing live at all. Not even lichens and molds, muttered Ilse. Her wide nostrils flared, and she sniffed. And I smell no bats, which is odd. They love such places as these. The lands about must be too hostile for them. But as for us, she added, there's just one little thing more. She pointed to the darkness at the rear, and Elof, retrieving his arm from Kermorven, sent light in the path of her gesture. The sudden flooding glow revealed a wide gap between floor's end and far wall, a well of blackness beneath. Stairs, said Ilse laconically. Used to be covered by slabs of this mosaic. See their fragments strewn about it now? And as for where they lead, well, it's too black even for my eyes down there. But the air's fresh enough. In fact, it's flowing this way. What'd that suggest to you now? A tunnel, said Elof, and whistled softly. You thinking what I am? Demanded Rock. Kermorven thumped fist into palm. Karis, this is the purpose in bringing us here. This is what we are meant to find. Elof frowned. Perhaps. But where can it lead? Around us there is only the waste, and this hill of stones. They must have fallen from somewhere, Rock pointed out. A high place we were too deep down in the cleft to see. A sudden rise in this flat land? Mused Kermorven. Elof is right to doubt. A tunnel it may be, but how long? Will we have light enough? We should go back outside and scout. His voice trailed off. Beyond the gap, the glimmer of sky had vanished. And there was now only blackness. Night had come again to the withered marches, and it brought them deep unease. Looks like we'd better camp down here, then, and wait for morning, muttered Rock, but he sounded less than happy with the prospect, and cast a suspicious glance at the sliver of darkness above. Doesn't seem like much shelter now, though. Elof agreed. Not open thus to the night, and with a second unknown darkness beneath us? We cannot even build a fire here. Kermorven nodded feelingly. A tunnel may lead down or up. I think before we decide to rest, we should at least have some idea what lies below. We may find some corner there that is safer, or at least more easily watched. Ilse shrugged. I'm ready enough. I confess, the further I am from that black sky, the happier I'll be. Then we will take a morsel of food and explore it ere we rest, said Kermorven. But Elof, hoard that light of yours, and warn us when it grows dim. Its last glimmer is our lifeline. When they had eaten a little and rested, it was with drawn sword that Kermorven led them down the stairs. Behind him, as he commanded, came Elof, arm outstretched and already beginning to ache, and with him, her large eyes peering eagerly into the darkness, was Ilse, whose Duergar strength could best support him if he lost his footing on the rubble-strewn surfaces. Rock brought up the rear, casting many a nervous glance back at the shadows that rushed in as the light passed on. It was no easy descent, for though cut into hard stone, the steps were narrow and steep and hollowed with wear, and at the top they were strewn with rubble that had spilled down. Very deep that stair led them, angling this way and that so that the travelers never knew what to expect round the next corner. But for long there were only more stairs, till at last it came as a jolt to find the next step as level as the last, and hear the faint echoes of their footfalls go fluttering away into air grown suddenly wider, cooler. The stair had become a level corridor, its rounded roof supported by arches whose plainness gave no clues to their builders. Through other arches, other descending stairs opened into it, but at its far end, only a few paces away, there was a wall of blackness. Elof's light reached no further into it than the fringe of an enormous flagstone, and yet somehow, perhaps through a change in air or sound, the impact of space and emptiness beyond was as tangible as a wall. Involuntarily, Elof clutched his fingers and the light vanished. Quickly he held up the gauntlet again, and as he did so, it clinked against metal. Something creaked, slow and harsh, startlingly loud in the corridor. "What was that?" hissed Kermorven. Hastily, Elof turned the light that way, and saw the warrior's tense shoulders relax a little, heavy hinge sockets protruding from the wall, and dangling from them the sorry fragments of what must once have been a strong gate. But as he stepped out into the space beyond, Kermorven's manner was still watchful, and Elof followed him. Following him, saw why. It was no mere cavern or tunnel. On either side of the gate, the walls stretched out as far as the light would reach. Their stonework was immense, yet somehow rougher and more ancient than in the chamber above. The flagstones, too, were larger, and laid without pattern or ornament. Kermorven gestured to Elof, who very gradually unclenched his fingers a little bit further. Light welled and spread over the dusty stones, but the blackness seemed to swallow it. And he had to loosen his grip still further. Then he sprang back and caught Gorthar ringing from its sheath. Rock growled and snatched his mace. Kermorven dropped into fighting stance, and his blade hissed and flickered in the still air, defying the tall and sinister bulk that seemed to burst in among them through the leaping shadows. But Ills only laughed, caught Elof by the arm and held it steady, and they breathed more easily. The shape no longer seemed to move. It was so close they had almost blundered into it. It was only a pillar, squat and unadorned, first of long ranks that stretched out glimmering into shadow, supporting the wide, low vaultings of the roof. If it had only been higher, this place would have seemed like some great hall, or even the square of a prosperous town, for its walls were pierced with gaps of deeper blackness, doorways and alleys leading away into night. Rock clicked his tongue in wordless astonishment. "Well," whispered Ills, "whatever this place is, at least it is not small. But clearly it was built more for strength than beauty." "Couldn't be some old warren of your folks, could it?" suggested Rock. Ills shook her head. "The masonry is excellent, but we have seldom built in such a fashion. We favor the living rock. Well, stair and corridor are bare enough, and poor places to linger. We might fare better here. Let us look." They spoke still in whispers, because the slightest sound echoed and carried so clearly in the still air, and because the hall was that kind of place. It reminded Elof of the great tombs and shrines of Bryhane, but with an air of power about it that all their decorations and stained glass could not match. Even when they found many of the pillars cracked or broken like diseased teeth in a healthy mouth, and that a great part of the ceiling had collapsed, bearing a good quarter of the square, it did not diminish the aura of strength. Rather, it increased their wonder that so much more of this ancient stonework still held firm, without sag or cracking that Ilse's keen gaze could detect. Somehow they felt no less safe beneath it, and sensed that strange atmosphere enhanced. "Yet it seems wholly empty," Kermorven muttered, stirring the rubble in one of the doorways with the toe of his boot. "And unmarked, undecorated, as if it were not in everyday use."
"Not wholly," hissed Rock. "There is something here. Elof, do you let me have more light, but be careful."
Rubble from the fallen roof had piled up like a landslide against one wall, and he was clambering eagerly up onto the heap, scrabbling away at debris covering what appeared to be a plaque of carved stone. Elof, straining to hold his hand higher, could make out some design on it in relief, but not what it represented. Kermorven hoisted himself up on long limbs to look closer, and a frown settled on his face. "A crest of some kind. A design like a flame with something behind it, something beneath. But it cannot be." And he too fell to digging away at the rubble. Then he paused and sat back on his haunches. "A beacon," he said softly. "A cresset, such as is burned on the tops of our tall towers to guide ships at sea. And behind it is shown the outline of a wide-sailed ship. Charis. I have never seen it drawn thus, but I know the sign well. Past all error, it is the emblem of our Mariners' Guild." He looked around and shook his head in sheer disbelief. "Then it was my people who built this place."
"Aye," breathed Rock. "Must have been. But why? And where are—"
The sound that stopped his words was all the more sudden in rising out of such utter silence, the more frightening in being in this sterile place the voice of something alive. But it was not human. It was a deep, coughing growl that came echoing out of the darkness. That it was far distant did not diminish the menace of it, and it jolted them back to the dangers of the realm they were in. Heads turned, bodies tensed, hands caught at weapons, too suddenly. The disturbed rubble shifted beneath them. Whose foot it was that first slipped, whose balance that was lost, did not matter, for none could have avoided it. Elof certainly was not to blame, for it was down upon him that the other slid, and tumbled among a landslide of loose stone and stinging, choking dust. He had no time to resist, nor any hope of it. The slide landed with a thunderous, torrential crash. His legs were whipped from under him, and he fell backwards, arms flailing. His head hit the paving with a stunning ring. His fingers clutched convulsively and sagged open. For a moment, it seemed that lightning struck in the chamber, so bright was the glare that filled it, showing every nook, every corner in stark relief and jagged shadow, setting every mote in the billowing dust cloud agleam and dancing like iridescent jewels. It showed the travelers to each other, sprawled in grotesque attitudes, wide-eyed, disheveled, dust-smeared, blood-streaked from cuts and scratches. Then it was gone. Utter blackness rushed in on them. A darkness so absolute it seemed solid, more stifling even than the dust. Elof, struggling feebly to rise, found himself seized by strong hands and dragged swiftly free of the rubble. "No bones are broken?" hissed Kermorven in his ear. Good. Get back to the wall, that way. Stay silent. Elof blundered into the cold stone and leaned there, fighting to quieten his breath, to listen in the absolute darkness. It was all too easy to imagine something, drawn by the noise, rushing towards them. But after a moment, he heard Kermorvan's urgent whisper again. Nothing stirs, so we have a few minutes at least. Is all the light gone, Elof?
Yes,
He choked.
I am sorry.
No fault of yours. Ills, if you can see anything.
Nothing,
She gasped, her voice shaken. Look back, whispered Kermorvan harshly. Do you press your back flat to the wall here, so, and you'll be looking back the way we came, to the stairs. Some faint glimmer of light might yet filter down.
Still nothing.
Her voice was shaking, and that was a rare thing.
It will still be night out there.
There might be moonlight, insisted Kermorvan with savage urgency. Move your head about. There may be a pillar in the way. Come, girl, you are our only hope.
No,
She sobbed.
I have walked too long by day. If we wait till dawn... Ah,
What?
light. Very faint, but true light. But that cannot be the way we came down.
We have no choice, muttered the warrior grimly. Even if it leads us into that beast, that way we must take. To linger is to court the same fate, for surely it will be able to hunt us by scent and sound.
And if there are more stairs on the way? Or worse obstacles?
Demanded Ills. Metal tapped softly on stone. I will feel my way with my sword, but the nearer we come to the light, the better you should be able to see such things. Take my hand, and Rock yours, and Elof, do you bring up the rear this time?
I don't mind,
Grunted Rock, barging into Elof as they shuffled along the wall like a troop of blind bakers.
Kermorvan is right,
Elof whispered.
Gorthar is sharper than your mace for anything to run onto it in the dark.
Quiet, and follow, said Kermorvan, and his voice had his sword's edge. Now comes the worst of it. And indeed it is recorded that, although there were dangers as great, few hours in all that long journey seemed worse to Elof than that travail in the dark. For in the blackness he could do little but find one footfall after the next, sliding and scraping across the stones, and listen and think. He lost a sense of the passing moments, and the fires of his fancy burned high. It brought back to him the stairs of Vade's tower, and the black emptiness he had sensed there, the wrath and regret that churned the very dark. Here, too, the dark seemed full, but of no single feeling. It was empty, yet filled with complex patterns, like the molds for some intricate jewel. It pressed in on him like a vast crowd, insistent, demanding. Were they the builders of this place, these thronging phantoms? He sought to separate them, to bring some distinct image of them into his mind's eye now that his outward sight was made useless. But what rushing towards them? But after a moment he heard Kermorvan's urgent whisper. Oop, wrong way. But what rose up before him was a single face, a startling image that faded even as it became clear. It seemed burned into his memory. Haggard it looked, hardened, yet in its way handsome, the jaw firm under a short white beard, the nose straight and strong but flanked by eyes that burned like coals out of deep sockets, belying the lines of age about them, the forehead deeply furrowed beneath thick white brows and hair. It was a commanding countenance, strong and wise, yet holding an alarming ferocity. And somehow it was known to him. He felt a great need to recognize it, and he wrestled with it in the blackness. He thought of Corentin, or Kermorven at his most lordly and ageless, but this man they resembled only in stern kingliness and strength. There was no likeness of feature, and this face wholly lacked the calm kindness native to them both. He felt that even its compassion would be fierce. It puzzled and haunted him all through that dark time, and for long thereafter, ere he came at last to the truth of it. How long they walked thus in the blackness they never knew. Elof could gauge it only by hunger and thirst, and lack of sleep. He was not hungry when they set out, but he was ravenous ere the end. He thought it foolish to dwell on that. Time enough for food when they had light. They had their packs at least, and Kermorven burrs also. There was food enough for a few days, if they were careful, though by then they had better be under the sun once more, and among living things. But where their way was taking them, that they never knew. They went a good way round the walls of that deep hall, across the mouths of many doorways and corridors that led off from it, whither they knew not. Every moment they awaited that dreadful growl once more, or a sudden silent rush out of the shadows. Elof clutched Gorthar tight, leaving the hammer at his belt, for it was little use if he could not see its target. At last, Ills found the opening that was the source of the light, and they turned to follow it. Kermorven sought to blaze the wall with his knife at this point, and others, to mark the way should they need to return. But he could seldom be sure whether he was marking an alcove or a corridor, or even whether he made any visible mark on the unyielding stone, and he soon gave up. Ills tried to count her steps, but the way was too long. There were too many stumbles. That they passed through at least one other hallway they were sure, for they touched more pillars. But it was far from there to the light. Deep into those winding ways it led them, from open space to narrow way, till Elof began to fear it might be some wisp of foul air, like the marsh fires that led travelers astray. But Ills insisted that it was growing brighter as they drew nearer, and Kermorven pointed out that they seemed to be following the flow of the air, raising hopes that it might be another way out. They heard no more of the terrible growls, and that too heartened them. At last, as they made their way down a wide lane, it seemed to Elof that he could see something more than the shifting colors of the eye in blackness, and a moment later he was sure. He could make out the shapes of the walls at the end, silhouettes against a faint greenish glow. It was not long before Kermorven also saw it, and Rock, and they hastened to find its source. The lane ended in another open space, this time round in shape, its upholding pillars arranged in circles. But as before, some were damaged or altogether broken, so that the stone roof had cracked in many places. Between those cracks some stone had fallen away and left a wider gap. It was through this that the light came, a long streak in the roof. Morven blinked. "I had not thought us so close to the surface," he remarked. "We may indeed find a way out here. Let us look closer, but this time take more care." The air here grew very cold. They edged closer, clambering more carefully over the heaps of debris gathering under the precious glow. Kermorven was the first to reach it and look up, but all he did was stand there on the rubble, saying no word, even when Elof staggered up beside him. He saw why at once. The roof was not open, and there was no sky beyond it. It was a pallid greenish radiance that filtered down, such as he guessed might be found in the depths of the sea, too dim for any eyes of men save those long deprived of better. The crack laid bare a solid surface like a seam of quartz, a soiled translucent white in hue. Elof, his brain numbed, reached up to touch it, but Kermorven seized his wrist.
No need to risk that,
he said in a strange, half-choked voice.
I know what it is,
and so also I know now what this place must be. He stared around them, wide-eyed, his face and voice a weird blend of feelings.
It is far that raven has borne us, very far. Beyond Taun La we have come, to the margins of the ice, and beneath. For there we see it, above our heads. That is the ice itself.
A cry of disbelief rose to Elof's lips and died there unvoiced. He saw as much on the faces of the others. They stared up at the riven roof, shocked, unbelieving, yet unable to deny that pallid whiteness shining through the rock.
But it can't be,
he heard Rock whisper in protest.
I mean, if there's a whole great thick glacier up there, then how's so much light getting through here?
It might be the bottom of a crevasse, muttered Ilse. Cracked deeper, perhaps, by the collapse of the roof. She hugged herself and shivered. The ice. I have seen it before, but never so close. Elof nodded. I have trodden it, crossed a narrow stretch of it. Evil is that memory, but never did I dream of passing beneath it. Indeed, he hardly dared imagine it. The glaciers that scoured the earth in their advance, the ice sheet that enshrouded tall mountains and left only their summits protruding, stark and bare as fleshless skulls, that incalculable, implacable weight of ice, crushing, malevolent, hung now only a few feet above his head, held at bay only by the flawed and transient works of men. The works of men. A sudden suspicion grew in him, a revelation brighter than this pool of light in the grim dark, a shock of understanding, coming so close upon the other that it gripped him and shook him hard. He knew now what else Kermorven had seen. Only dimly could he conceive all that it must mean to him, warrior lord. Prince in exile, last of a dispossessed line of kings. Even in Elof, of no lineage that he knew, awareness of where he stood awoke great awe, smoldering anger, deep regret, and a wild, coursing wonder. In Kermorven he read all of these, and more. The warrior quivered as if a storm raged within him, and yet his face was calm, transcendent, uplifted. That also Elof understood. Kermorven stood where he stood, and not even death could snatch this moment from him. His voice resounded in bright music against the ancient stones. Aye, my friends, Elof knows. Do you? Do you guess whither we have come? These are the underground ways at this land's heart, lost home of our folk, lost realm of my line. We tread where no man has trodden since the flight of Corentin 1,000 years past. We walk in all that remains of the city by the waters, the vaults and cellars and storehouses of Kermorven the city, the mighty catacombs of Morven. And out of time, beyond hope, a lord of Morven sets foot in these vaults once again. I have come back. He stepped stiff-legged down the rubble, staring around him as if afraid it was a vision he saw that might melt away at any moment. When he came to the nearest pillar, he pressed his hands against it, savoring the solidity of the stone. And he rested his head against it and closed his eyes, and spoke no word for a long time. Rock, too, gazed about him a while, and cocked his head approvingly.
So, this is home. Or what's left of it. Solid bit of work is this, to hold up with such a dead weight atop it. And it has a fine feeling about it, for all the dark and the chill. If this is the cellars, the city must have been a grand place.
He rummaged in his pack.
High time we had a bite to celebrate. Hard bread, smoked flesh, dried fruit, and a swallow of wine. Fit for a king. And I feel like one, coming back here.
Elof glanced at him in surprise. You say back, as Kermorven did. Yet neither of you has been here any more than I.
Ah, but we have. In spirit, like. These are the lost lands that were snatched away from us, and that we never thought anyone could see any more. I can just remember when I was a little lad, marveling at all the old tales of it. To set foot here, that's a marvel rarer yet. Don't you feel any of that? You're one of those old northerners by your looks, after all. This was where your folks sprang from, too.
I have felt something here, Elof admitted, but not that. Rock passed his handfuls of food, and while they ate, sitting with their backs to a pillar, Elof told him of his vision. Rock nodded vigorously, his shaggy red hair flopping over his face. He knew Elof well enough not to undervalue his feelings. And that would be of the last years, maybe, he mused, when there was mayhem and panic, and even barefaced treason by all accounts. Kermorven could tell you more.
Oh, that face you describe might belong in such a time. The ending was noble enough, aye, but the last throes were savage. They gave Kerbrahine that bad beginning. Come back to haunt it now. Still, it's the nobility that lasted here, I reckon.
Elof nodded. It is noble, true enough, but it is dead, and a place of great danger for us still. He stared up in dismay. How will I ever gather enough of this dim glow to light us out of here? It would take a day in itself. A plump finger jabbed him in the ribs. No need for that, boy. Leave it to the elder folk to flog their wits for you, as usual. Though I'll admit that the builders of this place were not impractical either, in keeping a good store of these ready to hand. And she dangled before them 2 long handles of rough stoneware, topped by cages of light metal, and from a bag she tipped lumps of some grayish substance. What we should have looked for in the first place. Pitch and tow and sweet resin, and many other substances too, I've no doubt. The city folk might have cleared their cellars when they fled, but they'd not bother taking their torches with them.
True enough,
acknowledged Kermorven, coming to join them. To their astonishment, he laughed aloud and hugged Il so boisterously he swung her from the ground.
I should have thought of that myself. The more so as the catacombs were intended also as a refuge in time of war, with great store of all necessities. Little did the builders foresee the coming of that enemy before whom no refuge stands.
Elof chuckled. You had much on your mind just then.
True enough,
said Kermorven wryly, slumping down beside Elof and accepting some food. Even yet I am amazed. That the catacombs endured I could never have dreamed, let alone that it was to them we had come. Your friend the Raven. I am torn between the urge to fall down and revere him, and to wring his neck. And do I not know that urge? Said Elof with deep feeling, and they chuckled. Hemmed by darkness as they had been, the promise of light made a vast difference to their mood. And when they had eaten and rested a few minutes, Kermorven swiftly grew serious. These catacombs, he said quietly, glancing around him. It is good, very good to have trodden here. To have sat at ease beneath the very citadel and strength of our enemy only adds spice to the drink. But let us not forget that is where we are. Great as it once was, it has become dark and perilous, and even I have neither wish nor cause to linger. He caught up one of the link holders and thrust a torch onto the spike at its heart. Let us see how well this burns, after 1,000 years. Rock was already flicking the wheel of his tinderbox. A fragment of smoldering kindling laid upon the dust-grayed pitch sank and smoked a moment, then blossomed to a flare of bright orange fire that set the shadows capering and dimmed the pallid ice sheen to nothing. The other torch flared as easily in its flame, and that one Kermorven took. And when you feel able, Elof, do you capture a little of the torch fire, and give us safeguard once more? Now, let us be gone from here. At once, though, it became clear that this would be no easy task. For from this circular hall many ways opened, and they could not agree on which one they had entered by. But at length Kermorven said, Do not despair, and lifted the torch he carried high, almost to the roof. The shadows raced across the stone and capered in the open ways, and he marked the way the flame fluttered. There is still the flow of the air to follow. It leads us that way, I guess.
Better than no guide at all, said Rock cheerfully. And at least we'll not be stubbing our toes so often now.
So it proved, for in the bright warm light they passed quickly over the cold flagstones of the ways, past many doorways dark and mysterious. Glancing into some of these side chambers, they found many empty, and some still stacked with bales and boxes they did not stay to examine. In this dry air their wood had not decayed, but in others box and bale had been torn asunder, and the remains and contents strewn violently about, sometimes right across the corridor, making a considerable obstacle.
Surely we never passed this,
grumbled Rock, wading awkwardly through a mess of shriveled debris.
We are off our path.
If you know another way, take it, Ilse snapped, kicked the rubbish from her boots. The air is still with us, said Kermorven calmly. It should lead us to some way out, even if not the one by which we came.
Aye,
retorted Rock, looking behind him into the blackness.
But how soon?
To that, Kermorven made no reply. He was weary, as the sag of his shoulders betrayed, bone-achingly weary, as they all were now that their flush of excitement had worn off, and sorely in need of sleep. Whether it was day or night now in the world above, they had no way of knowing. The only hour they cared for was that of their escape from this unhappy place. Rock's tread grew leaden, his head bowed. Elof found his feet dragging, his heart chill. Only Ilse, invigorated by being below ground, seemed to keep her strength. her wide eyes gleaming, her heavy boots skipping lightly over the flagstones with scarcely a sound. "Yet this is not my world," she muttered. "We live among soft light and even winds beneath the living stone. And if not those, then sooner harsh sun and bitter weather upon the stark surface than this lifeless shell. Here, death alone reigns." How truly she spoke, they were soon to find out. It was some hours later that the corridor again opened before them, into the curved wall of a small hall shaped like the half-moon. 3 other ways joined it, but the airflow led them to the straight wall opposite, and the great double gateway of steel bars set in it, most skillfully wrought and ornamented. But both outer and inner gates had long ago been twisted and half torn from their deep runners, leaving a gap through which even Kermorven could pass without ducking. Ill sniffed the new air disdainfully. "Do you not smell it? A faint rankness in it, like an animal odor. It might be bats, and that would bode well, since they must live within reach of a way out."
"Can't be too soon for me," grunted Rock.
Behind the gate lay a single corridor, wider than any so far, and as they held up their torches, the walls seemed to spring to life around them. Carvings covered them from floor to ceiling, delicately detailed but vivid and forceful, figures in low relief of men, women, beasts familiar and strange, tall ships and high towers, wide lands and mysterious horizons. And every now and again, as they moved down the long walls, the strangest figures of all appeared, human in aspect, but so eerie and vast, so idealized in their setting, that Elof knew he must be seeing images of the powers.
"That is so,"
said Kermorven, gazing about him in delight.
"This looks to be some private fane, or other place of reverence. For here are depicted tales from the early days of the world, before the coming of men or Duergar or any living thing, when it was given over to the elder powers for its shaping, and then to the new for the coming of life. Then it was, say the tales, that the elder powers rebelled, refusing to hand over the custody of what they had shaped and grown to love, to be used and drastically changed by mere growing things, plants and beasts and men."
Rock snorted.
"More fool they! A barren love, that, for a lifeless world. What was there in it worth their interest?"
"More than you might think," Elof told him. "For there is beauty and order in the patterns of matter that does not live. Think of the slow change and flowering of crystals. Might not a snowflake or spar or gemstone be to them as a flower to us? Or at the other extreme, might they not find beauty in the roaring energy of a volcano, the thunder and lightning of great storms, the ceaseless motion of the waves? We can, at times. Even the ice can be fair, very fair." He looked at one tall image of a woman, unclad, stately in her beauty, standing amid what seemed to be the waters of a waterfall, save that it hung above mountains, and its flow and billows were all of stars. Kermorven looked at him and nodded somberly, sharing a memory of majesty and terror. He pointed to the frieze around the image, within which, in archaic characters, a name was set. Ilse lowered her torch and spelled it out. "T-a-o Taunetar." She tilted the torch away hastily. "There's beauty you may have, for my money, and well rid. Why put her on your walls? You neglect the best and greatest of the elder powers, the one who never rebelled, him we most revere."
"Ilmarinen,"
nodded Kermorven. He lifted his torch so that the flames spilled and smoked along the roof, and waved a hand at the wall opposite. From floor to ceiling, a single vertical slab was set in it, graven with a single vast image. He was neither forgotten nor neglected. See him there, much as your folk portray him, Ills. Ills sniffed. You make him too human, too tall, like a long human, with huge shoulders and spindled legs, not fair in square proportions. And what is he hammering out on his anvil there? Elof peered down at the slab. It is hard to tell. The image seems worn or defaced. Kermorven held his torch lower. Yes, there are some gouges and chips out of the edge here, and many deep scratches. By the color of the stone beneath, they were done more recently, certainly since the destruction of Morven, as if something had been clawing at the slab.
There's a keyhole here,
barked Rock.
This whole slab's a door.
And a solid one, for it has never been opened or broken, said Kermorven thoughtfully. Rock groaned.
That'd be safe to sleep behind, if we could only get it open. Elof, you're a sharp lad with locks.
Not one's 1,000 years old, protested Elof. Time alone can weld metal, even without much corrosion. And how am I likely to succeed, when hostile hands have not? Their approach was less subtle, Kermorven said. They would not have battered at the door thus if they knew anything of locks. So why not set your hand to it? Elof sighed, took his bag of tools from his pack, and extracted a light hammer and some long shapes of bright metal, strangely wrought and twisted. There will probably be 10 open doors further down the corridor. Something open that suddenly becomes shut may attract a certain attention, countered Kermorven dryly, watching Elof tap all around the lock, feeling the vibration with his fingertips, then pass the long probes into the keyhole and tap on them. Well, do you think you can do it? Elof shrugged, produced a little bottle of fine oil from the tool pack, and dipped a probe into it. Who can tell? If it is as simple as it appears, I doubt that. Morven the city was a great center of our craft, and much wisdom was scattered to the winds at its fall. Yet, it had to start somewhere. If that lock was old even at Morven's fall. Elof's irritation flared. Then the accursed thing really will be set solid. Quiet, and let me work. Kermorven smiled tolerantly, and strolled a little way up the corridor, gazing watchfully into the dark. Rock and Ills joined him, peering at the carvings and talking in low voices.
What do you reckon that place might be behind there, anyway?
Muttered Rock, suppressed excitement in his voice.
Some secret hideaway?
Kermorven shrugged. It is hard to say. For people, you mean, or treasure. That is less likely. The lock is not well concealed, and the folk of Morven must have known there was no hope of rescue or recovery in their lifetime, or their descendants. But many old houses of Kerbrahine have some kind of hidden entrance or stair. You mean that could be the lower end of some such thing? Ills demanded. Leading to an escape, perhaps? Perhaps. But do not build up your hopes. For now, I will be content with some place to rest. Elof pursed his lips and went on probing at the lock. He had sprung its levers free. Oil was spread liberally over the channels where the key should travel, and he had traced their shape. It did seem simple. too simple to deter any save the most casual attempt to open it. Perhaps they had thought the great gate protection enough. Next, he must twist and tap a scrap of stiff wire into the shape of the wards, held in grippers. That should slide the bolt, if it could still be moved. He maneuvered the wire into place and began to twist it, squeaking and scraping through the channels. Up it went, up, and he became aware without turning that the others were breathing down his neck, tense and silent. Slowly, with all the delicate strength he could muster, he twisted it to the very top of the lock. Then it was as if fire and ice flowed into his arm, a convulsive, tingling shock that must have showed on his face.
"What is it?"
Kermorven hissed.
"Are you all right? Can you not?"
"I am a fool," snapped Elof between clenched teeth. "Who would place so strong a virtue upon so simple a thing? But there it is, a force of stern authority such as I have seldom encountered." "To what effect?" Ills whispered. "I don't know," muttered Elof. "It was too quick. I wasn't ready. I must—" Gritting his teeth, he twisted the wire once more, hard. Again that pain surged into him, but this time he met it, endured it, opened himself to it, and sought to read the resonances it awoke within him. A feeling grew in him, which became a note, a phrase, a line, a complex net of surging music. And in that music he heard words of stern command. "Look to the lock. The wards are of fire. Of ice the bolt. It stings. It burns. The hand that turns, that lacks the right, that serves the ill. It scorches. It freezes. Its strength shall consume you. Fall back then, false that you are." "Ah," he murmured. Never before had he been so clearly aware of the virtue within a work. It was as if words were reinterpreted, remade within his mind, as if the voice of that unknown smith of elder days spoke to him, self to self, through the power of their common craft. Eerie he found that, and daunting, and yet at the same time its sheer clarity aided him. "It says only one with authority may open this door. Ancient and arrogant and strong it feels. Older than the metal of the lock itself."
"Is that possible?"
demanded Rock. "If the lock were repaired piecemeal over many years, yes. And if that virtue were made strong enough in the beginning, which it surely was." Kermorven growled with impatience. "Then you cannot open it?" "Not directly, but let me think." "It would be a strong force indeed," he heard Ills murmur, "that could resist what is in him, if only he can bring it to bear." Elof searched his mind with growing impatience. In what would the lock recognize authority? A key set with a matching virtue? But keys may easily be lost in the course of time, and that spell was meant to last. Was that why the lock was made deliberately simple? So new keys could easily be cut, and used with some greater authority, less likely to be lost? Any number of locks could be secured thus. Most men would need some outward emblem of authority, imbued by smithcraft with virtues of command. But a smith might manage with a simple form of words, if only they were the right words. Or strong ones. The arrogant sting of that spell, the shock of pain and the contemptuous dismissal in the words, these had roused a great impatience in him. and it swelled now to danger. Kermorven had bidden him open this door, and who now was lord of these ruins, if not he? Elof bitterly resented being so daunted by this ancient force. He would meet its demand for authority with his own. He would create a counterpoint to that wild music, an answer to those challenging words, as surely as he had shaped wire to ward. And with that thought, his impatience turned to a harsh, insistent rhyme, a chant of authority no less imperious than that upon the lock. He leaned his head against the cold stone, and though he muttered the words, he seemed to feel them batter against the guardian thought like a forging hammer, like that of Ilmarinen in his image. By the self that hears your singing, and the craft that burns within me, by the strength I turned to evil, and the evil that I withered, by the skill that I have nurtured, by the knowledge I have gathered, by the courage of the seeker, and the quest that now I further. These the rights you shall acknowledge, these the strengths you shall bow down to. You, a singing of the old world, you shall hearken to a master, as a shaping to the shaper, in the image you are set in. As a rightful lord has willed it, by that will I bid you open. On the last word, he gripped the wire and twisted, this time with all his strength, ignoring the pain that lifted before him like a forbidding barrier. Then suddenly, astonishingly, it was no longer there. The lock was turning softly, silently, the bolt sliding smoothly back from the socket it had lain in 1,000 years or more. Elof let out a great sigh and sagged down on his knees, still clasping the grippers. Under his weight, the slab creaked out a little way from the wall and stopped. "Bravely done, my smith," said Kermorven admiringly, as Rock helped Elof to his feet. "Do you rest now, for since your skill has freed the lock, let mere thews do what remains." And he leaned forward, clenched his long fingers round the lip of stone, braced a foot against the wall, and hauled. Slowly, ever so slowly, the great door yielded to his careful strength. A finger's width, a hand span, the faint protest of hinges could be heard, but no more. Ilse ducked under his arms to add her own unhuman strength. Her shoulders tensed, the muscles stood out on her shapely limbs, tracing the shape of the heavy bones beneath. The slab advanced a handspan more, and in its exposed edge metal glinted, a diamond-shaped plate of tarnished bronze that could only be the lock. Upon it were incised many characters, but it was the cartouche upon the square face of the bolt that caught Elof's eye, that sowed within him a sudden unease. So fierce a challenge on a lock so simple. Those characters, that pattern, he had seen them on other bronze. His hand flew to his pack, to the wrapped shape of the scepter, and he saw at last what crooked shape it must be that Ilmarinen forged. That carven door must symbolize royal command, the power those characters embodied, and so he had misread that challenge. Not arrogance, but a stern decree of state. "Kermorven, hold! This may be no common hiding place." But he was already too late. Under the unison of strong arms, the stone was swinging outward with a momentum of its own, sending Ilse hopping out of its path, Kermorven striving to halt it lest it be torn from its protesting hinges. The torches fluttered, and from the open doorway the darkness billowed out like curtains in the wind. A slight rush of air swirled out after it, a waft of odors strange to the cold corridors, a heavy, stifling weight of dust and must, a strange scent tinged with a thin spiciness with aromatic resins and pungent balsam. It was such a smell as antiquity might have, the dust of withered summers, of faded years. Kermorven, releasing the door, swept up the guttering torches and stepped over the low sill into the chamber beyond, holding them high. They flamed up and flared. The blackness cowered away at their fire and fled down the long chamber before them. For a moment, Kermorven's tall shape hid it from the others, but then he seemed to crumple as if struck. His cloak billowed about him, and he sank down to his knees, the torches sagging in his hands. Red light and long shadows surged up the walls. Strange shadows they were, from the high slabs and pedestals of stone ranged along those walls, from the still shapes upon them. Kermorven bowed his head low in the somber glow. "What ails you, man?" Elof whispered, hardly able to speak aloud. Kermorven made no reply, nor showed that he had heard. "What is it?" persisted Elof, even more unnerved. "What place is this?" To those who knew him less well, Kermorven might have lacked expression, have looked like the graven image of a man painted into life, yet tinged with the stone that lay beneath. And they might have asked, those who did not know him, into what unimaginable depth or distance his gray eyes stared. His companions, each in their own way, knew better, saw the play of feelings inside him like the cloud shadows racing across a hill, like breath upon glass, heat through iron. His stony lips stirred, but it was not to them he spoke. "All that we were," he murmured, and shook his head, almost in disbelief. Rock, hearing the words, looked around him quickly.
It can't be," he burst out. "We've not—"
He bit his lip, and to Elof's astonishment, he looked ready to turn and run. Kermorven repeated the word softly. "All that we were passes, a sheaf of dry grasses, that come in green meads blue, to this end ere we come. Passed on sceptre and crown, justice and rule laid down. As least man must we rest, silent in our long home." "Ills and Elof, you would not know that," he said gravely. "It is the opening of the rhymes of lore that are called Arel Arhalain. Few in Bryhain now learn them, but that first line has become proverbial." A dreadful understanding cut through Elof's confusion. But Arel Arhalain, in the old words, that would mean the tale of lords, the tally of kings. Exactly so. And you could say you stand among it here, its living self, or that once lived. For as you feared, this is no common hiding place. We have strayed into the crypts of the ancient king's house, and by your craft laid open the place called Dorgal Arhalan, vault and tomb of the kings of the realm of Morven, the deepest hollow of all that land. All around us they lie. Elof could have wished the cold stone to open then and swallow him. For in his haste, his old ruthless haste, had he not seen that stern barrier only as a thing to be broken down, without thought or respect? Even thus an Ekwesh pirate might shatter a casket of fine crystal to get at the gold within. The kings of Morven, Kermorven's own line, his forefathers whom he most revered, like Corentin. Elof thought then of the brand that ancient lord had set upon him, of open honor and hidden shame. Had he not now earned it doubly? Elof Valentor, said Kermorven, and Elof sickened at the name. The warrior's voice was hushed, but the same cold strength was in it that the smith had first heard among the Duergar, and never forgotten. Well may you bear that title, for by the cunning of your hand you have brought an era to end, a long era of division, of separation, that should never have taken place. To this place of old it was the custom that every prince must come ere he took the kinship, to revere his ancestors, to take counsel among them, to reflect upon the end to which even such power as his must come, and so use it more worthily. And because the son King Karen sent east was too young to have done this, it was the pretext his enemies chose to deny him the throne, and all of us of his line following. Now let them regret it, for they have laid so much weight on that one custom that it shall turn as heavily against them. You have done me greater honor than I deserve, my friend. He looked round, met the astonishment on Elof's face, and smiled gravely. Did you fear it otherwise? Why? It was at my behest you broke the enchantment on the lock. What followed was mine to bear, for weal or ill. And bear it I shall. Share this with me, my friends. Look around you. Imagine. Wonder. Here lie in state the remains of the kings of Morven, since the first founding of that kingdom upon the then unknown shores of Brysael. Good 4,000 years ago. The shadows shivered suddenly. The torches were smoking, dying in Kermorven's hand. Yet he paid them no heed. A deep awe had settled upon them all as he spoke, upon Rock, upon Elof, and even upon ills, to whom the realms of men were slight and transient. And that same sense of presence which had troubled Elof in the outside blackness now returned. He looked from bier to bier, at the shapes that lay beneath dulled armor and the ragged remains of rich robes. Mere webs now held together only by dust and the rich metal threads of their ornament. Fit warning indeed for any aspiring prince, but a source of deep pride also. Elof thought he might find it in himself to envy such a lineage, yet in truth he did not. He cared little for his ancestry, there being so many other things he yearned to know. He could guess, though, what they must mean to Kermorven, these rows of shapes stretching out into the shadowy depths of the tomb, and to Rock also. Their silent majesty told strongly upon Elof, and all that they stood for, the weight of years, the building of a mighty realm of men, the long-sustaining and last defiance of it against the relentless, ageless enemy, and within all those the high events, war and peace, battle and building, the myriad lives of men that they had once both ruled and served. And they served them yet, bearing mute witness to the life of their kingdom when all other traces had been erased. Then the torches guttered again, and the thrall was broken. Ills snorted impatiently, plucked the link lights from Kermorven's fingers, and waved them about to rekindle them. "Aren't all here, are they?" she demanded. Didn't some die away from home or at sea?
Few, answered Kermorven, rising stiffly. And we always strove to bring their bodies back. Those few were here in effigy, with arms or armor that were theirs. You see those arches spanning the vault? They were once its rear walls, and marked the many times Dorgail Arlanen was extended. At the last the number of biers was increased to 200, and 164 kings lie here in state.
Ills chuckled sardonically. A grave matter, as you might say, then, that with all the spare accommodation, some should lie on the cold floor.
What?
Cried Kermorven, seizing back a torch.
If some enemy has defiled this place.
As he sprang forward, Elof saw what Ilse's sight had picked out of the shadows. Far down the tomb, to either side of the last arch, two shapes lay like a child's stick drawing marked in the dust of the floor. But the lines stood proud of it, and most so at the heads, for they were skulls. It was by the bones of two men that Kermorven knelt.
These were not thrown down, he murmured. Surely they lie as they died. Helms on their heads, harness about them.
Gently he lifted the remains of a mail shirt and a long halberd, still intact.
By the look of it, harness of the old royal guard.
Then he gasped and stood up suddenly.
The two guardsmen. Corentin said it. He took with him only 2 old men of his guard.
Slowly, almost unwillingly, he stepped through the last arch and stopped there. The others crowded behind him and saw as he did. The long rows of biers here were empty, save for a few near the arch. The dark shapes upon them were covered, as all the rest had been, by robe and mail and helm, all save the last. Like the guardsman, he lay uncovered, save by a great black shield, a sunken shape within his mail. But above it was no common helm, for even through the layers of dust the torchlight drew an answer from it, a glancing sparkle of brighter fires, glittering there in many colors about the head of death.
So, this is where he came.
Kermorven's voice was somber, deepened with sorrow, and yet within it the triumphant ring still sounded.
He and his comrades, to the heart of the city they would not surrender. Here they stood, as the ice ground and thundered overhead, and laid waste all they had known and loved, all that those around them here had built up. This place, at least, they could die defending. And when the ruin was complete, and this vault still stood, they chose to perish here, of thirst or hunger or by their own hands, rather than risk opening that door to despoilment and desecration. And they are proven right. He darted forward suddenly, and knelt by the side of that last bier a moment, while the others watched in silence. Then slowly he rose and reached out with hands that shook to the figure that lay before him. Gently, reverently, he detached the helm and set it down on the bier's end. Then, from his own pack, he drew the helm he had carried through so many adventures, and lifting from it its linings of soft leather, he set it upon the fleshless head. Only then did he lift the other from the bier, and drew his long cloak across it in a flourish. Dust flew from it like banished time, and in the torchlight it flared and dazzled as he raised it high.
In fashion, it was like his own, or the other that Elof had crafted. Jet black, high-crowned, with a face mask whose aspect was all hawkish ferocity and dire rage. But the slanted eyes of that mask were picked out in bright gems. The sculpted brows were shapes of silver and gold, and above them rode a circlet of gold in which a great white stone blazed among a setting of green gems, white as clear water, green as spring grasslands, golden as the kindly sun. "Behold the great crown of Morven," said Kermorven softly. His gray eyes shone with the light of the sun over the infinite oceans. "Against all chance, I have spoken with my kin, the last alive who walked here. Here I have come to what remains, to Kermorven itself, Morven the city, to him who sleeps here, its last king. From him I receive what was to him entrusted, and that he faithfully preserved to the end. And that trust I take upon myself. The chain that was sundered is made whole. The line that was severed is restored in me. No longer is he the last king of Morven, for another shall follow him." And he raised the helm above his head. Then, to the surprise of his friends, he lowered it, and cradled it in his arm, and smiled. "But not yet. I must give meaning to that name before I claim it." And he picked up the linings and began to fasten them within it. Strange, are they not, the workings of destiny? And foolish our wish to guide them. For Charon, my ancestor, sent the great scepter of Morven westwards, that his son might have regalia of royalty in his new kingdom, but kept the crown for himself, that it might remain in Morven as a symbol, I guess, of continuing resistance to the ice. Yet in the chances of time it was the scepter that was lost, and it is the crown that now passes into the hands of his kin. Then a great lightness came from within Elof's heart, warm as a wind from the living south, and beyond all doubt, all danger, his laughter rang in that solemn place like the laughter of the powers in the morning of the world. Strange are those ways indeed, Lord, stranger even than you can imagine. Yet, do not call them chance. For is it chance that you met and befriended a boy from Assenby, and helped him, among many greater causes and concerns, to recover a thing that had been his to use since childhood, in a humble labor? A thing so worn, so aged, that even you could not guess what it was. That I could not, till Corrington himself gave me the key. And he drew from his pack the rod that had been a cattle goad, and held it out before Kermorven's astonished eyes. By the craft within me, which brooks no gainsaying, I tell you now that this is the scepter of Morven. From Assenby it came, the home that Asa, who took the scepter, made for herself. It bears that pattern which only that scepter ever bore, and within it are set craft and virtues which even I cannot yet fathom. Receive it now, and read it as I do. A sign. For chance it cannot be. Kermorven looked at the rod, but made no move to take it. Instead he looked, more keenly yet, at Elof. "Who are you?" he muttered. "Corrington knew you. Morhewen knew you. If Assenby was indeed Asa's home, then you may be a descendant of someone from that time, and bear their face, as do I of my ancestors." Elof shrugged. "I was not born in Assenby. As to who I am, you have named me yourself. I have told you what little else I know." Kermorven inclined his head sternly. "Well then, whoever you may be, the scepter was given into your hands, and has been well guarded there. Do you hold it for me still? And if ever I come to any kingdom, you shall receive it from me again, as counselor and prince, next after me in all my realm."
"Well spoken,"
said Rock quietly, and Ills nodded. But Elof dropped to one knee. "My lord, I am not worthy of—"
"Will you question the judgment of a king?" demanded Kermorven, in tones that smoldered.
Elof raised his head defiantly. "Aye, or what use else as a counselor?" Then he noticed the faint twitch at the corner of Kermorven's thin mouth, and they all grinned. "Mind you," chuckled Kermorven, "I could as easily name you ruler of the stars, for I own them as much as, or as little as, any other realm. And I will hardly better my estate by lingering here." He gazed once more at the blazing crown, shook his head in amazement, and wrapped it lovingly in the oiled cloth that protected his own mail. "Come, friends, I have paid my respects to what has gone by. Now let us look to the times to come." He hesitated. "We could rest here, if you wish. Those who already slumber here would take no exception, I am sure."
"No thanks," said Rock hastily. "I've learned some lore of the past also, and one or two of these noble gentlemen weren't quite as accommodating as you."
"And the air is too dusty," added Ills, "with this reek of embalming. I would not sleep here." "Nor I," muttered Elof. "I might see that face again." "Well then, let us seek somewhere else," sighed Kermorven, sliding the bundle of mail back into his pack. "Come." But as he stepped back through the arch, he hesitated, looking to either side. Then he stooped and began to gather up the bones that lay there. It was the same humane instinct in him that had served them so well in their first encounter with Tapayao's children, that balanced the fearsome manslayer he would become. With the others helping him, he bore them back beneath the arch, and with swift care arranged them on 2 empty slabs. And he spoke to them, saying, "On the biers there lie by your lord. Living, you did not presume to, but his heir awards you that, the only honor he can. You shall be the last to lie in Dorgahal Arlanen, and in no less worth than all the rest. Guard it well until the changing of the world." Then he bowed to them, to the rest of the darksome hall, and last of all to the silent shape that bore his helm. And Elof and the others bowed also, ere they turned their faces to the distant door. But as they moved out beyond the arch, Ills sniffed suddenly. "That rankness again, and stronger than the dust." "I smell it also," said Kermorven. "Too strong for bats." Then suddenly Rock, who was leading them, cursed and swung his torch high, and they stopped dead, stood for 2 heartbeats unmoving, the very breath stilled in their throats. In the darkness ahead of them, on a level with Kermorven's head, 2 points of red fire shone with liquid brightness. They hung there an instant, glittering like the jewels on the helm, and Elof felt a sudden flood of the same cold terror he had felt at the tomb's opening, for he knew that they were eyes, They were too wide apart to be human eyes, and below them he made out a glint of white, glimpsed jaws, long and narrow, floating in the dark as if disembodied, yellowed fangs linked by streaks of saliva. Then the same coughing growl they had heard before filled the vault, and a waft of breath, hot and foul. So much Elof saw in that unmoving moment. Then he felt a sharper wind whistle by, like the sweep of a sword cut. But it was no sword. Kermorven had flicked down his link light so fast it flung out the ball of blazing pitch as from a catapult. Straight at those ghastly jaws it sped like a starstone, and the thing reared up in a wall of whiteness with a shrieking yell that seemed to split their ears. Elof grabbed for his sword, but Kermorven had been faster yet, stooping as he threw to snatch up the ancient halberd from the floor. He sprang forward and struck. The old blade bounced and skipped across the tangled whiteness, but scarlet sprang up in its path. Again the shriek, and the beast tumbled back between the rows of biers. Kermorven sidled forward, slashing, thrusting, leaping, harrying it. A huge foreleg lashed at him with a paw the size of his body, but Gorthar was in Elof's hand. The black claws met a blacker and flinched at its bite. Ilse bounded up. Her axe hacked at the limb with severing force, but passed only through the billowing fur. She slipped and fell. Her torch rolled aside, the paw descended. And then Kermorven had flung himself across her, and the blow fell upon the upraised halberd. The white muzzle snapped forward. Rock's mace struck and bounced, and a yellowed fang cracked in bloody ruin. The beast reeled and fell on its sloping back, howling and clawing at its jaw with its long forelegs, its shorter hind legs beating at the air. Kermorven scrambled up, helping Ilse, while Rock caught up the torch and ducked back. "Light another!" yelled Elof. "We dare not be left in the dark now." Then the thing made another blundering rush, and he thrust Gorthar to meet it. But the halberd hewed out in front, slashed a bloody streak below the eyes, and the beast jerked away, snarling, its claws scrabbling and clicking on the stone. Ilse stumbled to join them, and together they advanced on it, weapons swinging, forcing it back till its haunches met the door. It reared up as if to spring, but new light flared in the tomb. Rock leaped forward with the fresh torch blazing and thrust it straight at the bloody muzzle. The creature, caught off balance, tumbled back in a scrabbling mass and fell out through the narrow opening into the corridor beyond. After it leaped Kermorven, blade poised and the others behind him. Halberd arced upward, flung like a spear, but the beast sprang while the haft was still in Kermorven's hand, and in the air they met. Right in the angle of its massive neck the point took it, and deep into the fur it sank with all Kermorven's strength and the beast's own weight to drive it. Down on the stones crashed the creature, snapping and shrieking at the tormenting shaft. "Is everyone out?" cried Kermorven, thrown against the wall by the force of the blow. "Have we all our gear? Then Elof, shut that door!" Elof turned and seized the grippers protruding from the keyhole, and thrust all his weight hard against the rim. The great slab swung before him, ground forward on screaming hinges, and smashed into its socket with a reverberating crash that drowned even the screams of the wounded beast. The floor shook, stones and dust fell from the ceiling, and to his horror, Elof saw a crack race and radiate across it like the root of some dark plant. He twisted his makeshift key in the lock and sprang back as a wide chunk of the ceiling crashed down where he had been standing. Above the dust cloud, he saw Kermorven, sword in hand, hacking and slashing at the writhing heap of white before him. "Get back!" Elof shouted, hearing his voice crack. "The roof gives!" Kermorven sprang back. Then Elof cried out in horror as the creature threshed and struggled back to its feet. Blood poured from its panting muzzle, dripped from the deep slashes on its side. The shattered truncheon of the spear drooped from its neck, and yet, with ferocious fires unquenched, it reared again to spring. But it was not to have the chance. One massive paw, upthrust, slammed into the sagging center of the vaulting, with more than enough force to dislodge it. The whole center of the ceiling fell in, and with it a cascade of broken stone from above. Down upon the snarling head it fell, and the creature vanished in a thundering slide of rubble.
"Run!"
bellowed Rock as he and Ill scuttled back.
"For your lives!"
Elof, ducking frantically, grabbed Kermorven's arm, and together they fled down the passage, racing the cracks that spread along the roof. Glancing back, Elof glimpsed briefly the upraised hammer of Ilmarinen on the door. Beneath it, a white-furred leg kicking above the rubble. And then all was thunder and collapse. How long they ran, I could not guess, the torch flames trailing out behind them like starstones in the dusty air. The corridor was straight and level, else the ruin might have overtaken them. Only when they came to a stout arch did they pause, hearing the rumble and crash of stones subside behind them, and there they slumped down against the wall, panting and choking from the dust. "That was neatly done, Long Man," Ills told Kermorven, between coughs. He shrugged and shook dust from his shaggy hair. "The halberd was to hand, and much better in such a fight. A sword would have been too short to get past those great limbs." Ills eyed him. "It was not only that I meant, and well you know it." Kermorven shrugged again, in great confusion. "Dorgail Arlanen is well shielded now, at all events," he coughed, "and with a fierce spirit to watch at its gates."
"A stinking brute,"
Rock wheezed.
"Stalking us like that, slinking up all quiet. If I hadn't heard a claw click on the stone, and vicious with it. What was it anyhow? One of those big white snow bears?"
Kermorven shook his head wearily. "I think not. They live chiefly by the sea." "I've seen 'em," added Ills. "They're not so weighty, especially in the head. This was something different, something I've never seen. And yet—" "I know," Elof said. "It did look familiar. The jaws." He thought of others with such teeth, swift and savage little hunters, serpentine scuttlers across the snowfields, bane of hare and bird. More like Ermine or Martin, or that one they called the Glutton.
"Aye, and it was ferocious enough," said Rock. "But big as a bear?"
"The ice can breed such monsters, it seems," said Kermorven darkly, "or preserve them from elder days. Such were its main armies once. It found fewer men to serve it, ere the Ekwesh came." He stood up painfully. "Well, we should not linger here. The roof may yet fall further. What lies before us now?" Rock raised his torch, and the dust-blown air sparkled and swirled before their stinging eyes. Elof blinked and saw that they had come to a division in the corridor. No open hall as before, but a chamber whose other 3 walls each held an arch like the one they stood in, each with the remains of a gate. "Some crossroads in the secret ways of the king's house, no doubt," said Kermorven. "The way opposite is a corridor like this. The one to the left is a stair leading down." They peered cautiously into it and recoiled in disgust.
"The stench of the brute," grunted Rock. "Must be its lair down there. You smelt that, Ills, not bats."
Kermorven swung round. "No doubt. But the same is true for both. It could hardly have lived by hunting down here. So—" He held up the torch to the 3rd arch. It flared and fluttered suddenly, and by the uncertain light they saw a narrow stair curving upward into shadow. "One more effort," he grated. He swung his precious pack closer to his side, gazed back down the dark corridor once more, and strode to the stair. Rock also looked back. Ills did not. Elof lingered a moment, but now the torches were gone, it seemed to him that he saw something there in the blackness. A faint gleam and glimmer, pale, sterile, cold. He knew only too well what it must be. There also the ice now gleamed through the riven roof, like bone laid bare by a mortal wound. He shuddered and hurried after the others. The stairs were steep, and fouled by the beast that had used them. Generations of beasts, perhaps, by the claw marks on the stone. Only the strong draught of clean air made them bearable. The steps led to a tunnel, still sloping steeply upward. At its end lay another stair, and at its foot the air stirred with promise of the open. Here they had to rest, though the foulness still denied them the food they desperately needed. Their gorges rose at the thought. "And where could this be leading?" groaned Elof, as they staggered up the worn steps once more. "I guess at that," said Kermorven, his voice calm and encouraging. "At the margins of Morven the city there was a high hill, the King's Hill, that was left green and wooded for the folk to enjoy, with many fair walks and parks at its foot, open to all. But its summit was the king's own park, whence he could escape for a while the cares of his high office. It was said that a secret way led there from his palace, and this is surely it."
"But what a way!" complained Rock. "We must have walked twice the width of Kerbrahine by now."
"And only crossed the southern side of the city by the waters," said Kermorven with weary pride. "For the king's house, as I recall the old accounts, was in the south quarter of the city, which was the first built. By so much was what we had mightier than what we have made. By so much are we lessened." The brand he carried flared suddenly, and it was as if his voice caught its flame. "But it shall not always be so." And then he laughed and sprang up the stairs with the lightness of an eager child. The others scrabbled after him no less wildly, guessing what he had seen. And as Elof, still last comer, rounded the curve of the stair, he also laughed aloud. For there before them was a narrow little landing, an arch much cracked and worn, with empty sockets in the stone of it, empty of hinges corroded to nothingness, corroded by the open air that flowed around them, dark and cold and clean as a mountain stream, infinitely refreshing. Upon the landing, Kermorven seized the others as they came puffing along, swinging them up with casual strength to join him. When Elof arrived, they linked arms and staggered out through the arch. But even as they emerged, their smiles and laughter died, and a weight settled on their hearts, a clutching hand as bitter and sharp as the air that stabbed their lungs like blades of adamant. In the open, indeed, they stood, and upon a hillside. But it was a hillside scoured bare, utterly barren even of soil, as by 1,000 flaying winters. Above them, very close, was the summit, stark and shelterless against the chill sky of new night, cloudless, moonless, naked to the searching stars. And not far below them the hill of stone vanished, engulfed as by a sea. But the sea was calm, its waves unmoving, solid, their flanks faint streaks of gray against the enveloping whiteness. Elof remembered his first sight of it, this dazzling mockery of a living ocean, and the summits that thrust up from it like short-lived islands, their resistance pathetic, meaningless to a foe that could wait upon the leisure of time and wield the weapon of erosion. The King's Hill was such a summit now, and a low one. All around it, without breach or break, there blazed the eerie majesty of the ice.